everyone. Welcome to this IIRSM lunchtime webinar. We're really pleased to be hosting you from the Northeast branch and very excited to welcome our speaker today, who is Nikki Masterman, the founder and managing director of Inspired HR. I've known Nikki for a little while now. She's an excellent speaker and really interesting with some brilliant insights, specifically on conflict management for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nikki. We'll be taking questions throughout and asking Nikki at the end. So if you've got anything, please pop them in the Q&A or chat box for us, and we'll be watching those. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nikki.
Fabulous, thank you. Hi everyone. So I haven't got many slides today to show you, as I'm very much about, I'm just that person that can talk, and I talk from a place of expertise. So I am going to share my screen with you because I've got a couple of slides, but it's only a couple, and then I'll turn them off when I'm doing the majority of my talking. So we're going to be talking today about conflict management, and it's going to be around how you manage the risk on conflict management and dealing with difficult individuals, difficult conversations. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the things to spot to really help you manage that risk within the workplace. So a little bit about me is, so I am a mum of two. I have a daughter who is just turned 23, a little boy aged 10, and I have a beautiful grandson called Grayson to my daughter, who was born just under 3 years ago with Down syndrome and is the light of our life. I have done over 30 years in HR, so I really have worked my way up. I'm qualified by experience, so I've gone the hard route. I haven't gone the academic route. And I've really worked hard at honing my skills and really becoming an expert in my field. So over 30 years, 24 years in the corporate field, primarily with Tesco, Asda, Costa Coffee, Game Station, so some big brands. And I'm now approaching my 9th year in business, where I've took it from a standalone HR consultant to a business of nationwide consultants, territory management, and much more. So a little bit about my business. For anyone that knows me, I'm really passionate about HR and inspiring great HR. It's basically our mission as a business. And that basic mission was on the back of being treated quite badly by one of my corporate employers, where they didn't manage the risk of myself during maternity, and I was handled quite badly, and I won my own successful tribunal, which is on public record. And I just wanted to inspire people to help people and businesses understand that people are human and do great HR and treat their people with respect. However, if you know me, you will know I'm also very no nonsense. So my business operates under a set of values, and the values spell friends, and it's family is my biggest and important value, real relationships, integrity, enthusiasm, no nonsense, dedicated, and keeping HR simple. So I have a fantastic culture in business. And for me, it's all about I empower my team to have trust, respect, and really make mistakes and learn from what they do, and thrive and trust them. So that's a little bit about the business. For me, passionate about people and inspiring great HR. I'm a school governor. I am a mentor for the Girls Network, and I mentor other HR professionals setting up in business because I've been there and done it. I'm a mediator for civil and commercial disputes, and I'm a mediator and workplace trainer for businesses and HR teams on workplace disputes and how to manage them. I am currently about to start my qualification to also be an ADHD coach, and that's on the back of I've been asked to be a nationwide HR company and expert on helping put this into workplace. And I'm also a guest lecturer on HR for Durham University. So lots going on for myself. So a little bit about, let's move on to the subject, conflict management, guys. We all want a wonderful workplace culture where, everyone gets on, there's never any disputes, there's no grievances, there's no disciplinaries, and, everyone wants to thrive in that workplace. But the reality is that it's part of life, and people will be people, and conflict occurs. So when this does occur, how do you manage the risk around that? What do you need to look for? Now, from a workplace dispute and conflict point of view, I will never be out of work, neither will any of my consultants, because it is going to happen. But what can you do as a business to help manage that? And how can people who also manage risk around health and safety in other professions work with HR to really get this right? So a few stats for you. 28.5 billion per year it costs to manage employee relations in the UK. This is actually equal to £1,000 per employee per year. I know that's pretty scary, isn't it? 10 million employees are affected due to conflict within the workplace every year, and half of these will suffer with anxiety and stress on the back of it. And quite often it also then leads to absence, resignations, dismissals, poor performance, poor absence. So it really does affect the business massively. It actually costs £2.2 billion a year in absence just purely due to conflict. And it actually costs businesses 15 billion a year to replace some of these people that are affected by it. So those are some really scary figures in there for you when it comes to conflict management. So what can you be doing to help manage some of that risk? Now, one of the biggest things around conflict is that people quite often clash. 70% is two people not getting on and conflict within the workplace. And one of the big things I talk about when it comes to communication is that's what leads to conflict, miscommunication. Now, communication comes around three key areas: body language, tone, and your actual words. But what percentage does that intent and impact have on a person? So 55% of your body language will convey what you're trying to say, 38% will be your tone, and actually only 7% of the words you use when it comes to communicating to someone is actually understood. So if you remove the body language and you remove the tone and you send a text message or an email, only 7% of your intended message is actually going to get through to that person. And this is why conflict quite often happens. I mean, come on, guys, how many times have we sent a message that says fine in our heads, but someone at the other end, because they're having a bad day, has heard it as sarcasm, there's no kiss maybe on the end of it. So it's kind of affected that person in a different way to what you intended. So intention and impact are two very different things. And as soon as you start removing tone and body language from your communication style, it really can have an adverse effect on what you're trying to convey. So think about that in your daily life and your work life. So conflict management, sometimes conflict can be obvious and visible, two people arguing, people threatening, someone raising a grievance. However, conflict is not always visible. Sometimes there could be things happening outside of work. It could be somebody being excluded from a social event. It could be a sarcastic comment from someone that you haven't seen or witnessed, or between two people. So conflict is not always obvious to people. And also be very aware of festering issues. If you are aware someone's not getting on, there's a clash of personality, or there's something going on around performance, make sure you address it, because the longer things are left to fester, the more it can lead to a full-on boom, and then you end up with grievances coming in from every direction and people being pulled into various meetings, and it quite often leads to underperformance and absence. Some of the most common conflicts that we see in the workplace are a clash of personalities and people not getting on. And as you may or may not know, personalities come under 4 different colour types. And quite often, colours and similar personalities are attracted to each other. That's a whole other presentation for another time. But quite often when people are not similar personalities, that will lead to a conflict. Competence and performance is quite often seen as conflict as well, and that is something that should be managed in the workplace. And the risk of not managing that is people don't always understand, they don't take on the feedback, they walk out because they feel misunderstood or that you're not addressing issues, and this obviously then leads to the risk of employment tribunals. And quite often conflict, 40% of any conflict that arises is actually between a line manager and one of their team, and often comes down to miscommunication or performance management not being undertaken. So 40% of conflict is quite often between an individual and a manager. Some of the best known conflict that you will come across is bullying and harassment. Please be aware they're two very different definitions. One is defined under the law and one's not. And quite often they arise. There's a big focus on sexual harassment and conflict this year due to some legislation changes. And again, some of the biggest ones are performance management. Now, something to be aware of from a risk point of view, an employer is likely to be held liable even when they had no knowledge that conflict existed. Your defence is to show that you take all reasonable steps, even if you didn't know as a business, to manage that risk. Now, that risk basically means things like, you'll do your regular handling and health and safety training. There's an expectation that's refreshed. Same with bullying and harassment and diversity and inclusion training. That must be done and it must be refreshed. That will be your protection at tribunal, same as it is under health and safety risk, that you have taken active actions even when you know it doesn't exist. You don't need to wait for conflict to arise. Reasonable steps to manage the risk, and you will know this if you do health and safety or anything else. Have your robust policies, have your training in place, have your refreshers, review it regularly and make sure it's up to date. Make sure you've got training and properly deal with complaints. Watch out for victimisation though. So for example, what do I mean by that? If you have handled a grievance and someone has been found to be bullying or harassing someone, be very careful how that person is then managed afterwards, because if you exclude them from anything, they could also bring a claim against you for victimisation. So be very careful that they might be excluded from conference because they've maybe recently been disciplined for treating somebody badly or causing conflict. Be very aware that also they are protected as well against various things. So, what are you going to see when you've got a risk of conflict in the workplace? Things are going to include people showing their anger, high turnover, employee relations issues, disciplinaries, grievance, performance management. You'll see a culture issue, people not getting on. People will be making comments and be argumentative. They might push back and refuse a reasonable request by a manager. Attitude, sometimes power struggles between someone when they have a new manager, complaints and bullying, criticism, threats, fighting inside and outside of work, lateness, extreme banter. Be very careful of extreme banter. You'll be surprised at how quickly it can escalate. And obviously non and low performance is quite a common one and these are things that you will see in the workplace when you have got conflict of some nature. But what effect does this have on people? I've obviously talked about how 50% of people affected by conflict will then be affected by mental health and other issues and workplace issues on the back of it. Some of the things you will see is they will stop growing when it comes to doing their job and their career. You will have costs in the business because you are having to pay for mediation or disciplinaries, and it's a cost in time, expense, loss of people, HR picking it up, absence and impact on the business. You'll see it in their behaviours. You'll see it in people's affected on well-being, their engagement in the business and wanting to come into work. Morale, communication will be affected. Employment tribunals will start to arise. Motivation and productivity will drop and be non-existent in some people. Sales and profit is a huge one. All of that will affect your sales and profit as a business, and that's a real day breaker. Attraction and retention, you will struggle to attract and retain great employees because the culture of your business, if you're not managing conflict, will soon start to filter out on websites and platforms where ex-employees will start to have things on social media. So it really can have a massive impact on your business. Now, when conflict does arise, disciplinaries, grievances, performance, some of the things that you can do to manage it and deal with afterwards is cultural training, having a great people plan, mediation, employment tribunals, grievances, training, dismissals, disciplinaries, absence training and management, without prejudice conversations and settlement agreements. These tend to be the after effects of conflict in your business, sometimes when it's handled well, sometimes when it's not handled well Well, mediation is a big one, taking over grievance at the moment, which is why we are mediators in this, because it's sometimes cheaper to mediate between two people because it's more of a win-win and they get to say what they need to say to each other in a facilitated and structured way that is voluntary. Grievances, there's never any winners. People don't get to fully say what they want to say, and the person that's raised the grievance will often feel like they've won over that person. So mediation is definitely the way to go now when there is a conflict between two individuals as well. So how do you prevent these things? Make sure that you are dealing with any hurdles and festering issues. Make sure you've got training plans and leadership and development in place. Make sure your health and safety are in place, because quite often risk ties in very with them when it comes to risks as well. Make sure you build good relationships and nip things in the bud. Quick informal chats that are recorded. Don't wait for things to raise a grievance, just nip it in the bud and deal with things informally. Set clear expectations on what you expect of people if they are not performing in relation to their behaviours and standards. Mediation, HR facilitation and meeting facilitation. It could even be that you do DISC insight profiling, help people understand each other's behaviours and how they can work together as a team, and understand what people's strengths and opportunities are. Be very honest with people. Please don't beat about the bush. People need to have honesty, otherwise nothing changes, and don't bury your head in your stand. Bring in specialists if you need to, and obviously occupational health. We work really closely with occupational health and health and safety because the risks do filter into other areas, and we build very close collaborative partnerships with these people. So some tips if you do end up managing conflict in the workplace. A lot of people say, oh, you're only allowed a union rep or another employee. I always say, allow a family member or allow a friend in that meeting. You can manage that mediation, and sometimes they can help people see what you can't get across to them. So family and friends can add a good influence into those meetings for you. Record your meetings, whether that's by Zoom or your phone. We don't note take anymore. We record our meetings and then we get them transcribed for tribunals. Otherwise, they get a recording of the meeting. The reason we do that is it makes the individual and their union rep, if they're in that room, help manage and be professional in that meeting. It also means they can't throw anything at us where they might say we've been unprofessional or anything like that. It will also capture behaviours, tone and language, which doesn't show in written notes. So it really helps if you do record your meetings, and we build this into our policies that we're allowed to do it. Get professional partners in place, health and safety companies. I quite often tag team with health and safety when there's claims or whistleblowing brought in around conflict and health and safety. Insights people, occupational health, mediators. So build great partnerships that you can just pull in and use them when you need to. We also partner with one of the top UK employment barristers in the UK and part of the HR Inner Circle. They are a lifesaver. They are the best people to bounce complex employee issues off, whether it's health and safety, occupational health, well-being or HR. They're a great circle to be in. And we quite often have discrimination and dispute specialists on hand when something's very messy as well. So that's very much about conflict management, what you will see, what you will experience, ways to manage it. I feel like I've thrown a lot at you. We will send out some notes afterwards on all of the different things that I've talked about. So don't panic if you've not captured everything. We will send our notes out on email. So I wanted to talk about some of the conflict cases that I've dealt with in my 30-year history and some of the most interesting ones. So during the pandemic, the most interesting grievance we ever had arise was a lady that raised a grievance around COVID and safe working in the workplace. So when all of this came in, we actually originally had a grievance for 117 points of grievance, and she refused mediation. So we had to hear it. Now with this, I did partner up with a health and safety consultant because there was a lot raised around health and safety. And it was obviously very, very complex with COVID and the guidance changing constantly at that time. And when she raised it and then things had changed, it really made it a much more complex. Now, this employee was a nightmare. We had 3 months of grievances appeal Her appeal arrived within 2 hours of her getting a 57-page grievance outcome from the pair of us. We also used our solicitor in this because it was so complex and unknown, because there was no case studies for us to work from in relation to tribunals, and it really was an unknown. So myself and the health and safety guy, we responded to all of our points between us, and it was obviously in line with COVID at that time, or what was in line now, and we obviously were able to respond to all of it. We found a couple of things in her place in her favour, but a lot of it wasn't. Within 2 hours of her getting that grievance, which took us 27 hours to pull the outcome together, she had another 130 points of grievance and started pulling other things in. So it was a very complex and the most messy and expensive grievance we've ever had to deal with. Another grievance around health and safety that I've dealt with in my history, and you may or may not have come across this many years ago. During my HR days when I worked for Asda, I'd been headhunted. I was working for Tesco, got headhunted to go work in Asda and went to work with a store manager. Now, this store manager's behaviours were really bullying to the store managers, but I wanted to get under the skin as to why his behaviours were this way. He had over 30 years service with Asda. He was coming up for retirement. He was probably nearing 40 years service at the time. He would slam his fist on the desk. He would make managers sign in and out of his desk and circle them in red pen if they were 1 or 2 minutes late. But his behaviours, and I know he suffered with diabetes, which also affected his behaviours, were really unprofessional and sharp. And he was a lovely guy, but there was clearly something going on. And sometimes we have to get under the skin. Now, when I got under the skin, he'd gone through 3 HR managers in 9 months in this store, and I was the 3rd one that came in. However, I took the time to understand his behaviour and what was leading to it. And when I sat down with him, he had actually been the store manager at Cardiff Bay Asda when a customer had actually got decapitated in the car park. So what had actually happened was this car had been driving in, you get the big metal barriers that goes across the car park. And with it being Cardiff Bay, it was very windy. It had not been secured properly. And the gate swung as a car was driving in, and it was a gentleman with a young child in the back of the car. The barrier went straight through the window screen and actually went through this gentleman. And obviously it was very horrific for the staff there. The store manager was on holiday in Tenerife at the time, an ambulance and counselling, and there was a lot. It was still very fresh. It was about 6 months prior when I'd gone to work with the store manager, so it really was horrific. Now, what was causing this for the store manager was the police were actually pursuing corporate manslaughter because he held the responsibility for the store, even though he wasn't there at the time. He also had conflicting interests with the employer Asda at the time, because they were clearly obviously trying to protect themselves and saying all these bulletins and releases had been sent out to the businesses in relation to securing these barriers. At the time, he was actually able to prove they didn't, and that wasn't the case. But he felt like the company he worked for at the time also didn't have his back. And obviously this went on for years, but he was getting pulled in to all-day meetings. So with this individual, it was about me helping to manage his welfare. We moved into a quieter store where there wasn't so many issues, and he was able to see his last 2 years of retirement out whilst he was dealing with all of this through the health and safety executive, the police and the company. So that was probably one of the most horrific things I had to deal with. But I also knew the personnel and HR manager at the time for that store that was having to deal with that as well. And there was a lot of trauma and counselling. I also worked for Serco at the time when there was a young student killed at York Leeds station, where the guard had allowed a train to move when she was leant against the train drunk. You may have experienced that issue again. That was where we then worked with the health and safety team for Serco, because there'd been the accident at Leeds station, and they dealt with Northern Rail at the time. So again, we assisted in some of those cases. So it does help when you build these partnerships to really build collaborative relationships and help manage the risk. Health and safety, HR, we're all about risk prevention, compliance, and trying to protect the businesses. So those are some of the conflict I've dealt with. I've obviously dealt with other things that are not health and safety related. You know, I've dealt with an individual that was about to be terminated under short-term termination that then slapped a grievance in for sexual harassment. The company owner assured me nothing had happened. When I went into her grievance, she showed me a text message from 9 months prior that had actually indicated a comment about her having the company credit card, and that was fine as long as she was happy to show him the underwear that she bought. So you'll be surprised at some of the things that we deal with. Needless to say, that employee was settled out under a settlement agreement as there was no protection I could give them. I managed to settle for a lot less than she had asked for, but that was an interesting case. We are only as good, the same as the rest of you guys, as what you were told and the information you were given, of it being accurate and timely. So I really could probably write a book on some of the cases I've dealt with over 30 years. You know, there was a time I was duty manager in retail, walked in at 7 o'clock in the morning to be called into security, to have to see a video, which I asked them to turn off after a couple of minutes, of 2 employees having sex in the bees, wines and spirits aisle between 2 cages. So you can imagine me having to bring those 2 individuals in and asking them if they would like to see the video, which we had to do because they're entitled to any evidence as part of that process. The young lady resigned, the gentleman went off on the sick with stress, and then eventually he resigned, as neither of them wanted to go through that process. So you'll be surprised at some of the cases I've dealt with. So that kind of covers off some of the cases I've dealt with. I guess it's now to open up the floor to any questions in relation to risk, or any cases that you may or may not have, or some questions you may or may not have. Handing back to you guys.
Nikki, thank you so much. That is really, really interesting. It's so yeah, kind of multifaceted and complicated, because I suppose the most complicated thing on this planet is probably people, and you know, you're right at the epicenter of it. So, well, I'm going to argue people and sustainability, but that's bringing my own biases into it, in terms of job roles. We have had many people actually come through and just ask, obviously the content that you provided is so valuable, whether resources will be shared after this. You did mention in that presentation that you would send through some links, and I know Zoe's going to share some information as well.
Yeah.
Okay, before we open it up to everyone, if you don't mind, I have a question. So from kind of a small business perspective that is, you know, looking for opportunities to grow and, you know, is considering taking on employees and that kind of stuff, is there kind of like a minimum, you know, that should be on our radar? So like fundamentals or yeah, foundations for everything else to grow off. Like what is the best place to kind of start to see whether you have a good understanding of where your risks might sit?
Yeah. So one of the most common questions we get is, when people first approach us, we always do a free half-an-hour consultation anyway, and send them a little survey, which is a bit of a risk review. So we ask questions like, do you understand what the working time directive is and break entitlements? Have you got a contract or a handbook and policies in place? So the law is very clear when it comes to employing anybody, that they are entitled to a statement of particular contract on day one, not 2 or 3 months down the line, day one. You must pay no less than minimum wage. People are entitled to minimum breaks. You must have a grievance and disciplinary policy in place, as well as a health and safety policy if you have 5 employees or more, but I always recommend you have that in place anyway, because it's really important that people understand the basics on health and safety. Obviously, you should have, we always talk when we do the risk assessment about health and safety. If you've got someone for health and safety in place, make sure all your risk assessments and your emergency procedures are in place as well. So there's some real basics you've got to have in place, you know. So we help businesses get those basic documents in place, and we do little packages for startups to up to bigger packages where they start to grow. The biggest thing when you set up your business is make sure you know the culture and the people you want to bring into your business. They have to align to your values and your mission. All of the other HR stuff, and it actually starts the compliance and the risk as soon as you start thinking of employing someone. Start from the point you start to recruit. If you put anything in a job advert that could be deemed protected or discriminatory, you're in hot water. You know, so it doesn't start from the point you employ someone. It actually starts from the point you start to advertise and start thinking about a role. I'm a big believer, as I'm sure many are on here, of allow the experts to do what they want to do. You may think it's cheaper, Googling and things like that. The law is changing dramatically, and we've got a lot of changes coming this year. Please don't Google and take Google documents off the internet or plagiarize historical documents, because the law has changed so much in relation to things over the last 2 years. It's a no-brainer. It will cost you a lot more in the long run if you don't get things set right from the beginning. So HR compliance and risk is very much the same as everything else. And sustainability fits into that as well. You know, so sustainability is a big word now, you know, so that was something that Zoe helped me focus on as a business. So we are pretty much paperless as a business. We use electronic notebooks. We only use paper versions if we've been given them, but all my team get electronic notebooks. We don't print anything off. All of our forms are sent to you. They can be incorporated into PDFs and Word so people can do them online. The only time we're not paperless is if we have to have a case file and a very complex hearing with us, or it has to be submitted to a court or a solicitor. So we're very forward thinking in the way we work and trying to be as paperless as possible. We plant trees. So again, all your compliance, your risk, your sustainability, get it right from the beginning. Before you even start thinking of recruiting someone, think about your values, your culture, make sure you know. If you don't know employment law, because you've built a business quite often because it's what you love to do, health and safety, people get health and safety and HR mixed up. They come to us for payroll advice. We're not payroll. They come to us for health and safety. We're not health and safety. They're all different professions. Instead, engage someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not a sustainability expert. That's why we work with companies who are. I'm not a health and safety expert. That's why I work with people who are. You know, I have solicitors because we get pulled into restrictions. They're civil matters. So, you know, but the basics are your contracts, your handbooks, your policies. Make sure your employee liability is added to your insurance. These are all different things we ask in our mini risk assessment about making sure health and safety is in place, your contract and your policies are in place, that you've got your risk assessments in place and all that kind of thing. So they're the real basics. Leave the experts to do what they do, but otherwise it will cost you more in the long run.
It's a really interesting time, I think, across the sectors with changes in compliance and legislation over the next couple of years. So it's why, you know, platforms like IIRSM are so valuable, you know, providing such diverse kind of content for consideration, because it's a bit of a minefield out there. I've got another question through. We might just be able to squeeze this one in. So what if a grievance of bullying was in fact unfounded? How could the person who was incorrectly accused be dealt with, and what redress do they have?
So when a grievance is raised,
I'm just going to say, sorry, kind of 7. Oh no, actually we've got more time. Sorry, I've misjudged it. Carry on.
Fine. I left plenty of time for questions. That's because I knew I was going to send anything out. So when it comes to a grievance, people often think when they raise a grievance that because they were the first one to raise it, they're protected, but actually grievances apply to everyone. So quite often when someone raises a grievance and it's vexatious, the other person can raise a grievance back. Now, this is sometimes where mediation can work, because there's no winners when you have 2 vexatious grievances that pulls everyone into hearing and they just get an outcome letter. But the person that's had it raised against them has the right to raise a grievance back. And sometimes they do that during the process or after the process. However, if someone has handled that grievance very well and they've got a good policy in place, it does say in there that if a grievance is found to be vexatious, they retain the right to take it further. Now, I had one very recently, and it was the worst text message I'd ever come across that she'd sent. So I had 2 employees in a business, clash of personalities, used to be best friends. We had a grievance come in at 11 o'clock from an individual against another individual. So say A had raised against B. At 1 o'clock, we then had one come in from B to A. Now, the A, who had raised the first grievance, has actually sent a really nasty text message to B, calling her a psycho and a corkhead, and really, really, I've never seen in 30 years a text message like it. It was horrific. And she put the grievance in first, trying to protect herself and not knowing we'd already been made aware of the grievance and the text message. The other person then raised it on the back of receiving that text message. So I now had 2 grievances and neither knew about each other, because until you sit down with them and they have to be interviewed, and then you have to interview them about theirs. So person A that had originally raised it ended up with an outcome where there was no findings. All the evidence was put to her about what would receive from the other person. The other person was told, yes, leave it with us, appropriate action will be taken because we don't give anything more the way. And that person then got her outcome, advising her that we were recommending disciplinary action for bullying, harassment and vexatious behaviour to the business, and it's up to them as to decide how they pursue it. So people think when they raise a grievance, they're protected. They're not. If it's found to be vexatious or they've done something wrong, a good HR consultant or business or HR person will recommend that appropriate action is taken on the back of it. They won't recommend what level or anything like that. They'll just say, as the next stage is, you now need to deal with the disciplinary for this person, and it's up to you as to how serious you take it, because it'll be based on that company policies. But people are not protected by raising it, because if it's found to be vexatious, nasty, horrible, or that it's found against them, we would recommend that appropriate action is taken. That other person will never be told what that action is, because that's confidential to the person that's having it taken against them. But nobody's protected, and they quite often think they are, and they're not. All grievances is making you aware of conflict for you to look into it into a fair, full and reasonable process, and making recommendations and findings on the back of your evidence. Now with employment, it's reasonable belief and balance of probability. It is not the same as criminal or civil, where it's 100% you've got to have all of the evidence. It's reasonable belief as to who you believe sometimes as well. So
Okay, wow, that's a lot. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for the question. That was a really interesting one. So yeah, fundamentally tell the truth.
yes.
Okay, Brill. Does anybody have any kind of final questions for Nikki? Please feel free to pop something in the chat, or turn on your microphone. We'd love to hear your voices. You can put your camera on as well. I'll just throw that out. We've had a really decent turnout, which has been really nice. Otherwise, we're probably going to call this to a close. Nikki, thank you so much for your time and for your insight, and also just, kind of absolute transparency into the complex nature of this particular field. And I think your title was bang on. It is certainly navigating a storm. As we said earlier, we will share some of the references and contact details with attendees. This will also be recorded and uploaded onto the IIRSM website with your other webinars. So we'll let you know when that's live, and please feel free to share with your networks. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.